The Law and You, a look at laws in St. Vincent and the Grenadines which affect our daily lives. The Law and You, presented by lawyer panel P.R Campbell QC and brought to you on SVG-TV as a public service.
Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, boys and girls, greetings. Welcome to another presentation in this public service nation-building series, The Law and You. This is program number 990. And it is coming to you on Monday the 30th of November 2020. On this program, I will speak to you on the topic, the decline of civil society. But before getting into the topic, a few short preliminary comments. Firstly, and as usual, I would like to send out my deepest condolences to all families which have suffered recent bereavements. And in that connection, belated condolences to the family of the late Calypsonian Mr. Alexis Lexi Joseph, who was laid to rest last week. I was not there, but I saw snippets of the eulogy delivered so ably by one Mr. Bernard Thomas Marksman, Lexi's friend from boyhood days. Bitty, well done. Secondly, to the family of the late Mrs. Sylvia Friday, who passed away at the age of 95, one of the matriarchs of Beckway. My condolences to His Lordship, Bishop Friday, and to the Honorable Dr. Friday, and all members of the family. Secondly, there continues to be queries about the appointment of a deputy prime minister. I explained at some length on the last program that even though the position of deputy prime minister is not specifically catered for in the Constitution of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, yet there is nothing unconstitutional about a government appointing a deputy prime minister. And for those who might not have been convinced by what I said, I would invite you to go to the website of the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court, look under the heading Judgments, and look for a decision which was handed down on the 13th of October this year, that is a few weeks ago, by the Court of Appeal in the case George Rick James versus the Honorable Gaston Brung and the Honorable Stedroy Benjamin. George Rick James versus Brung and Benjamin. And in that case, the Court of Appeal of the Eastern Caribbean explained once again, and I will quote from the case, the Constitution, and they're speaking about the Constitution of St. Kitts, expressly provides for the the Constitution of Antigua. The Constitution expressly provides for the Governor General to establish offices of Minister of Government and to appoint to such offices persons nominated by the Prime Minister from the members of the House of Representatives and or the Senate. The Constitution further provides for the establishment of a cabinet from among the ministers so appointed, and gives the Prime Minister and not the courts the power to determine the composition of cabinet and the number of cabinet members. Outside the express provisions of the Constitution, there are no legal restrictions as to the number or qualifications of the members of cabinet. So the position is that our constitution, like the Constitution of Antigua, with which that case dealt, provides that the Prime Minister has the power to make appointments to the cabinet of persons who are elected and up to 2 senators on the government side of the House. And one of those ministers can be designated the Deputy Prime Minister, so that even though the Constitution doesn't say there shall be a position of Deputy Prime Minister, there's nothing wrong, absolutely nothing wrong, with a government naming a minister as Deputy Prime Minister. The way that Mr. Hudson Tanis was named Deputy Prime Minister in Mr. Cato's days as Prime Minister, the way that the Honorable Edward Griffith and myself successively were named as Deputy Prime Minister, and the way that Sir Louis Straker was named Deputy Prime Minister here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So let there be no doubt as to the propriety of having a Deputy Prime Minister, even though we don't have the office specifically named in the Constitution. All right, I get into the topic for the evening: the decline of civil society. I will tell you what prompted me to decide to do this topic. In the Eyewitness News publication of the 22nd of November 2020, a young gentleman by the name of Mr. Kenrick Quashie wrote an article, and the heading by Eyewitness News is, quote, "The more things change," unquote. And this is part of what Mr. Quashie had to say in that article. He was speaking about civil society and its decline. Quote, "The current political system breeds corruption, political patronage, political victimization, and partisan political divisiveness. We must impress on our government to do the right thing and enact integrity legislation." Skip one paragraph and he goes on. "I can't but help to implore Prime Minister Dr. Gonsalves to act on strengthening the supposedly independent institutions, even as he plans his exit from political office and prepares for a transition. What a legacy he will leave if he ensures that the independence, integrity, and operations of government is not left to the whims and fancy of future leaders, personal integrity, values, and principle. These and many more can be done without constitutional reform. They are within your current purview as leader of this country." Then, 1 week later, the said young gentleman, Mr. Kenrick Quashie, wrote another article in Eyewitness News, the 30th of November. And this one is called "The Death of Civil Society and Activism in St. Vincent and the Grenadines." And in that article, Mr. Quashie writes in part, quote, "A vibrant and strong democracy is dependent on the involvement, agitation, and resilience of those who are considered to be the watchdogs of democracy. These are the trade unions, community-based organizations, national organizations, the Christian Council, and so forth." In those very thoughtful articles. Our young brother has lamented the sad, what in one article calls the death of civil society. I wish to endorse what the brother has said, and he has said that with dismay and grief in his heart. But it is true, sadly, that in the last few years, civil society organizations have become so quiet as to be regarded as having declined. But I wish to go further. I wish to offer a partial explanation for what appears to be the decline in civil society. When the Constitutional Review Commission was inaugurated in February 2003 by a resolution passed in Parliament by government and opposition acting together, a body was set up by Parliament consisting of a chairman, a deputy chairman, 5 persons nominated by the Prime Minister, plus 5 alternates, 2 persons nominated by the Leader of the Opposition, plus 2 alternates, and the following civil society representatives. I will name them out. The Commercial, Technical and Allied Workers Union, 2 persons. 2 persons representing the diaspora. When I say 2 persons, 1 plus an alternate. Also represented on the CRC were the St. Vincent and the Grenadines Teachers Union, the SVG Medical Association, the SVG Employers Federation, the SVG Christian Council, the SVG Credit Union League, the SVG Chamber of Industry and Commerce, the SVG Bar Association, national sporting organizations, national cultural organizations, the Public Service Union, the National Workers Movement, the National Council of Women, the National Youth Council, and farmers' organizations. Those were the civil society bodies who were invited to sit on the Constitutional Review Commission to produce a revised constitution for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So there were 5 political positions, 1 from the diaspora, and all of the others represented civil society. I had the honor to have been appointed first as deputy chairman, and after a few months of service, the chairman, Dr. Nicholas Liverpool of Dominica, received the call to go back to Dominica to serve as its president, creating a vacancy in the chairmanship, and I was appointed by government and opposition jointly to be the new chairman of the Constitutional Review Commission. The deputy chairman was named as Mr. Noel Jackson. Now, the persons who represented the political parties and the civil society organizations, which I named out, were some of the cream of the crop of vibrant, patriotic talent in this country. And please permit me to name them. For the Prime Minister, you had Mr. Ronald Marks, Mr. Kenneth Brown, Mrs. Audrey Gittins Scott, Mr. Robert Fitzpatrick, and Mrs. Zoila Ellis Brown. The alternates were Mr. Lyndon George, Mr. Frank Branch, Mr. Glenn Jackson, Mr. Grantley Williams, and Mrs. Miriam Roach. For the leader of the opposition, you had Mr. Israel Bruce and Ms. Nicole Sylvester, now deceased, and the alternates were Mr. Elvin Jackson and Mr. Randy Boucher. Mr. Jofford Sutherland represented the diaspora. The Commercial, Technical and Allied Workers Union was represented by Alice Mandeville and Mr. Lloyd Small. St. Vincent Teachers Union represented by Mr. Oswald Robinson and Mr. Sheldon Govea. The Medical Association was represented by Dr. Lenoir Dakin Anderson and Dr. Franklin James. The St. Vincent Employers Federation was represented by Mr. Don Providence and Mr. Gerald Crick. The St. Vincent and the Grenadines Christian Council was represented by Mr. Carlton Williams, MBE, and Mr. Colin Williams. The SVG Credit Union League was represented by Mr. Cecil Ryan and Mr. William Harry. The Chamber of Industry and Commerce were represented by Mr. Jerry George and Mr. Martin Laborde. The Bar Association was represented by Mr. Bertram Commission QC and Mr. Douglas Williams. National sporting organizations were represented by Mr. Oswald Brown and Mr. Brenton Milligan. National cultural organizations were represented by Mr. Hugh Ragge and Mrs. Sylvia Williams, Ms. at the time. The Public Service Union was represented by Mr. Nigel Weeks and Mrs. Frances Clark Palmer. The National Workers' Movement was represented by Ms. Silma McLean and Mr. Clifford Gould. National Council of Women represented by Mrs. Muriel Byam and Mrs. Paula Morris. National Youth Council was represented by Mr. Andre Liverpool and Mr. Joel Abraham. And the farmers' organizations were represented by Mr. Renwick Rose and Mr. Wilberforce Emmanuel. Mr. Winfield Williams was the research officer, Mrs. Glenda Francois, the secretary, originally Miss Celine Jack, but she went to head the Postal Corporation. Miss Lisa Joseph as clerk typist, and Miss Gracie John as driver office attendant, the cream of the crop among the Vincentian patriotic community. Now, and I'm saying this mainly for young persons who don't know much about these things, who are too small when these things happened. The elder ones among you would fully remember what I'm speaking about. We of the CRC, the Constitutional Review Commission, set about holding a series of consultations in St. Vincent and the Grenadines And then we found out, and we sent delegations to Cuba, to Jamaica, to the Virgin Islands, to Barbados, and to Trinidad and Tobago. Simultaneously, we sent delegations to North America, to the United States, and one to Canada, a delegation of these CRC members. And then we sent delegations to England. I headed the two delegations. We sent the first one in 2003, and another trip was made in 2004, canvassing the opinions of Vincentians. We did a very thorough job. And we produced several reports to Parliament because we were appointed by Parliament and answerable to Parliament. And we gave periodic reports of our stewardship. And then on 28th February 2005, we issued our final report to Parliament. Now, in that final report, we made several recommendations as to how our national constitution could be remodeled. Several of the recommendations we made were fundamental in nature. But I want to speak to you on the rest of this program and hopefully next week's program, because this topic will take 2 programs at least. I want to speak to you about the 2 most fundamental recommendations we made after discussing the matter at home and abroad among our Vincentian brethren. One was to give civil society an enhanced role in the governance of the country, and the other was to set up a body called NACE, or to be called NACE, N-A-C-E, the National Advisory Council of Elders. I will read out the specific recommendations to you on next week's program, but I'll speak in general terms on this program. We gave our reasoning for this. We said, look, Parliament traditionally has 2 sides, government and opposition, throughout the world. In some countries, there is one House of Parliament, namely House of Representatives, mixed with persons appointed to be called senators. In some countries, there are 2 houses of Parliament, the lower house, called the House of Representatives, and an upper house called the Senate. The lower house being persons directly elected by the voters, and the upper house, the Senate, normally people who are appointed by the political leaders and the head of state. What we proposed for St. Vincent and the Grenadines was a parliament with 3 components, not just 2. And when I read you the rationale next week, you will see what our thinking was. We said, look, traditionally you have government and opposition, and that system leads to political tribalism. And according to our Westminster system, a government normally enjoys almost a totality of state power, and an opposition has little power at all, if any. We said, no, let us create for St. Vincent and the Grenadines a new constitutional model. Instead of the two sides, government and opposition, let us have a parliament with three sides: government, opposition, and the civil society. Government, opposition, plus civil society. The government and opposition would be mainly persons elected by the voters, plus, in the case of government, we recommended 2 senators. In the case of the opposition, we recommended 1 senator. And then we recommended 7 civil society members, elected democratically by civil society organizations, sitting in parliament as a neutral, non-political body. Then we recommended the formation of NACE, the National Advisory Council of Elders, to be composed, as I will read out to you next time again, next Monday, Divi, of persons who had held high office in government, in the judiciary, and in some professions, but who had reached retirement age. This body was to be a purely advisory body. Their role was simply to discuss matters referred to them and to give their considered opinion as elders with experience, collectively far more than anyone else had. When we put this report forward to the political parties in the House of Assembly, you know what the parties said? Both the government ULP and the opposition NDP, both of them said, no way. We do not want a constitution with civil society having any role in the parliament. And we do not want any NACE, any elders having any existence under the constitution. Both parties rejected our fundamental proposals. And when the members of civil society heard the politicians, I remember Dr. Gonsalves and Mr. Eustace really dismissing them in scathing terms. Say, to get into parliament, you have to be a politician, you have to belong to one party or the other. Nobody coming in parliament through the back door. If you heard how they carry on. When the members of civil society who are in the CRC heard that, to a man and woman, they became demoralized, discouraged, disappointed. And I had to coax many of them to continue because they figure, well, they're wasting time. If the CRC should propose to the politicians that civil society should be part of governance under a new constitutional structure, and the politicians don't want to hear about that, what they have us as civil society advising on a new constitution for? And my friends, to me, that marked the beginning of the decline of civil society in this country. Because when eventually the time came for the referendum, the persons who represented civil society on the CRC said, look, they have no time to waste to canvass in support of a referendum with a constitution that excluded them from participation. But I will read the text of what we said to the politicians in our report. So their rejection of civil society directly led to a progressive loss of interest and a progressive decline. People said, oh, you want us to help draft the Constitution. And when we put forward these progressive ideas, you don't want to hear about it. You're telling us that only politicians should come to the parliament. And that was the beginning of the end of civil society, as you know it. So, Brother Kwashi, if you check me out, I will give you a copy of the report we had to show you what the politicians rejected. And then you begin to understand why is it the position is now that civil society has fallen into such decline that you are complaining and you could be writing about the death of civil society. But more next time, Divi. So I look forward to being a further service to you next week, Monday, Divi, for a continuation of this topic in the series, The Law and You. Do have a pleasant week, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and may the good Lord continue to bless us all.
The Law and You, a look at laws in St. Vincent and the Grenadines which affect our daily lives. The Law and You, presented by lawyer panel P.R Campbell QC and brought to you on SVG-TV as a public service.